Hello, and welcome to this AQA A-Level Business revision video focusing on 3.2.3, understanding the importance and role of stakeholders. In this video, we're going to explore who are the different stakeholders, what do they want, what is stakeholder mapping, and then the importance of giving stakeholders what they want. Quick reminder that my teaching here is separate from any of my teaching and consultation roles around the country. My name is Mr. Giles. Let's get down to business. First of all, we have to consider who are the different stakeholders. Now, this is a quick recap from GCSE Business. If you've never done it, hopefully this will catch up to speed. It's not all that difficult. This is not an exhaustive list, by the way. There are probably many more you could come up with, but the further away from this list you get, the more niche you become. So I've just got the classics here. I've got customers, employees, so on and so forth. In the pink there, I've got what it is that they want from a business. So what is it they desire? What is it they need? I'll spin through a couple to give you a bit of a rough idea. However, over this side of the board, I've got the word conflict, and that's important. I want you to keep that in the front of your mind as we go through what each stakeholder wants. First of all, customers. They want fair prices and fair quality. And I use the word fair, but I might swap it out for the word appropriate, because when we go to Primark, for example, we expect prices to be somewhat on the cheap end. But when I inevitably buy my first Ferrari, folks, I don't want it to be cheap because I want everyone to know that I've got loads of money. So an appropriate price for the appropriate product and the appropriate quality. Again, when I go to Primark, I'm not buying clothes that I think will last me forever. But when I buy that Ferrari, folks, it better last. Okay. Up next, we've got employees. And again, fair wages. And I've put here fair hours. When you get your first part-time job, you can't be expecting £20 an hour, folks, unless you're watching this video in 2045. Okay. You just can't, because you don't have the skills to garner that kind of wage, essentially. And when it comes to hours, you have to make sure that they are sociable, or at least in the rough vein of what you were expecting. If anything is unfair for employees, they get very upset. So anything fair that the employees want, that's what they want. Up next, we've got suppliers. Suppliers want to get paid very quickly. They want to get their money back real quick. And they also want the business to grow so that you place more orders. Up next, we've got the government. They're pretty easy to please, if I'm honest. You just give them some tax. As long as you pay your tax, you're all good. And if you don't break the law, they're generally pretty happy. We've got pressure groups. These are tricky, folks. The pressure groups I want you to focus in on are things like trade unions. Yeah, we've got things like Greenpeace and Just Stop Oil and all those kind of extreme ones. But really, the business is dealing with day-to-day pressure groups, such as trade unions. Now, what do trade unions want? They want the business to behave ethically. Okay, trade unions want workers to be paid appropriately, want the hours to be fair, they want the workplace to be safe. They just want the business to behave itself, not too dissimilar from the government, except for the pressure groups exist to work on the micro scale, whereas the government works on the macro scale. Up next, we've got the local environment. They're quite tricky to please because they've generally always got a bit of a complaint. But generally speaking, they want minimal pollution, with that sound, congestion, road, traffic kind of thing. They want, no litter, all that kind of stuff. They just want, if you're going to operate your business in their area, to look after their area. And then they also want jobs. They want first dibs on the jobs. So Google turn up to Cork, for example. It's one of the kind of famous examples. They turn up to Cork because they want to have one of their head offices somewhere in that part of the world, and then start importing people from around the world to work in Cork. And the people of Ireland went, well, hang on, can't we have some jobs? We've got wonderful computer scientists. Can't we have some jobs? And there was a bit of a ruckus around that. We've then got the owners / shareholders who depend on the ownership styles. If you haven't watched that video, I'll link it down below. Go and watch it, please. You either have owners, i.e. sole trader or partnership, or you have shareholders, if it's a limited company. What do they want? Money. They want the profit. They want the dividends. They want decision-making power as well, obviously, but really, they want the money. And then lastly, the bank. I just like throwing this one there because it's quite fun. The bank want you to take out money. They want you to take loans. They want you to take risks so that you borrow money from them because you're going to pay it back with interest. So that's the whistle-stop tour of all the different stakeholders. And if I point over to this word conflict, you can see how none of these stakeholders are really going to get on if you put them in a room. The employees want their fair wages, but the shareholders want a really big dividend. You can't really have both. You can't pay workers really well or very fairly and make maximum dividend. So there has to be a bit of a compromise there. And then customers, for example, they want really fair quality, but suppliers just want you buying more. So they want you churning it out real quick. You can't have really good quality and churn out products really, really quick. They don't go hand in hand. and so on and so forth. So you'll find conflict all over the board. Up next, let's have a look at stakeholder mapping, which helps us determine which stakeholders we should actually care about. So when it comes to stakeholder mapping, it's a wonderful way of determining who do we need to listen to, who do we need to take action with, and essentially where does the power lie. There are two axes. The way you label the axes isn't that important, but it will move some of the labels around. So if you try and remember the way that I've done it, you'll remember where all the labels are. So up the left-hand side here, we've got the level of power. So how much power does that stakeholder have on the business? And it's just measured from low to high. And then down the bottom, how interested is that stakeholder in the business? Again, low to high. And there are four very clear quadrants, okay? So let's go with the bottom left-hand one. We've got the monitor quadrant. These are any stakeholder that has low power and low interest. I've put the bank down here just as an example because unless you're borrowing money, they've got a low level of interest in you because if you're not one of their customers, they're not really interested, and they've got a low level of power. However, if you do borrow money from them, then unfortunately they would move to a different quadrant. But to be honest with you, unless you borrow money from them, they're not all that important. Up next, we've got keep informed. Now, keep informed is any stakeholder that generally has quite a lot of interest in your business and what it's doing and so on and so forth, but generally speaking, doesn't have a great deal of power. And this quite conveniently describes pressure groups. Now, when I say they don't have a lot of power, they only have power when they all work collectively together. Trying to get every employee to agree to go on strike is actually very difficult because don't forget, when people go on strike, they lose money, so on and so forth. Not everybody shares the same view. So not all people who are in that trade union want to go on strike. So really, how much power do they have? They don't have maximum power. They can't bring the business tumbling to the ground without ruining their own livelihood, but they do have a certain amount of power. Now, if we go back in time to maybe like the 80s or the 70s, that wouldn't be true because trade unions were much more powerful back then. Unfortunately, there's a lot of government legislation that stops them being too powerful. So that's why I put pressure groups over there. You could put some other different stakeholders in here as well. For example, you could put customers, because if you're a business that is the only person who supplies this particular product, i.e. a monopoly of some description, then customers don't have a lot of power at all. So I quite like using Transport for London as an example. If I have to get the train into London, I only have one choice of supplier, unfortunately. So I have to get on that train. So I've got a high level of interest, but I've got zero power. And when they charge me what they charge me, I just grumble the whole way there, but I still go. Up next, we've got keep satisfied. These guys have a lot of power, but generally aren't all that interested in your business. So that perfectly describes the government, because assuming you pay your tax and you follow the rules, the government isn't interested in you at all. They don't care about you, but they do have a lot of power because the government can obviously shut you down. Now, depending on where you are in the market, maybe customers fits here, maybe employees fits here, because they might have a lot of power and they'll only start having interest if you don't then fulfill their needs. Like their interest will massively increase. And again, this is all very circumstantial, okay? And then lastly, we have the top right-hand corner, the high and high, the manage closely. These are often referred to as key players. And we would always usually map shareholders and owners here because they ultimately have the final say, the big power, and they are very, very interested in the business. Now, depending on the situation, if you're in paper 3, you've got a case study, or paper 2, then customers and employees might find their way over there. However, it really does depend on the position of the business in the market. So once we can map out our stakeholders and we know how to deal with them, we can then enable us to make business decisions that best satisfies each group. So if you've got a business that isn't really all that interested in its local community, it doesn't have any trade unions, so on and so forth, but customers really are managed closely, they're key players because there's so few of them, then the decisions you make will probably satisfy them as much as they would satisfy other people who you want to manage closely. But again, that's very circumstantial. Okay, so we know who our stakeholders are and we know where to map them on our stakeholder map, so we know who to listen to and who not to. However, here's the secret sauce, because some of this belongs to other parts of the specification, but it all kind of links together. If you're in year 12 right now and you don't know any of these terms and phrases, don't panic. You might not have learned them yet. If you're in year 13, you're in the right place. So how do we stop stakeholders having conflict? How do we stop them being upset with the business? Or how do we make sure we're meeting the needs of all of our stakeholders, assuming that we want to, in terms of the manage closely, keep satisfied, etc.? Well, here's some ideas. For customers, it's quite straightforward. Just do continuous market research and listen to feedback. That's why we have things like review sites, Trustpilot, etc. If we just continually do market research and we make that a part of our marketing budget consistently, we will always find out what customers want and we'll be able to meet their needs. Now, there is some tricks around this because there were some great examples of where research was done and unfortunately customers didn't really know what they wanted, and then when they got what they wanted, they then decided they didn't want it. Okay. Now, if you've never learned the story of New Coke, it was a Coca-Cola thing back in the 80s, I want to say, New Coke, go and YouTube that. It's great. Interesting story about they research and how it all fell apart. Okay. So do some market research and then listen to feedback and act on that feedback. It's really quite straightforward. Up next, we've got shareholders. Now, shareholders have a board of directors that are picked by the shareholders. So it's a business's prerogative to make sure they're listening to the board of directors because they tell the business exactly what the shareholders want. Now, inevitably, shareholders just want more dividends, right? And that's what the board of directors is going to tell them. But it's still important that there is a clear line of communication between the managing director and the board of directors. If you're not sure about that relationship or who those people are, leave a comment down below and I'll make a video. Then we've got employees. Now, this is really simple. We just engage in employee engagement and involvement techniques. So this is where you might have some sort of suggestion scheme for workers. This is where you do things like delegation, or you lean on leadership styles like consult or democracy. And you just try and involve workers as much as possible, because the more workers have a say and the more that they do by themselves, they have autonomy within the business, the more likely they're to be satisfied and continue working for you. And then lastly, trade unions. This is quite simple. With trade unions, you have to do consistent consultation. So anytime you're about to make a decision that has a direct impact on employees, consult with the trade unions and ask them the very simple question, is this going to be okay for your members? Will they accept it? Now, they might go to you, well, hang on, let me go and ask some members and then come back to you. Or maybe they'll just stand there and go, yes, this sounds wonderful. It sounds fair. Should things be going wrong with trade unions, then unfortunately we have to engage in what's called collective bargaining. And that's where we sit around the bargaining table and we try and hash out and come to some sort of agreement on what the business wants and what the employees want. It's very important that businesses engage in that as often as possible to meet the needs of employees, assuming, of course, within our stakeholder map, that's what we want to do. If we're saying, actually, we just want to keep our employees informed, we might tell trade unions what we're doing and then just move on with our lives. That's it for today's video. I'll catch you in the next one.